Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. We're going to talk about Simon Sinek's book, The Infinite Game, today. And I'm joined by my partner in crime, Director of Professional Development, Mary Katherine Duffy. Mary Katherine, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad everyone's here. This is one of my favorite books, and I think this is going to be a great webinar.
It's a lot of fun. So as I mentioned when everyone was coming on, we're going to go a couple layers up from some of the things that we look at. We're really not looking at operational things today. We're looking at more strategic thinking, more generative thinking, and really how we're framing the conversations that happen at the board level. So if you've read Sinek's book, The Infinite Game, this will be a little bit of a recap of that. If you haven't read it, then we're going to try to summarize it. But before we go further, I want to share a video with you. This is Simon Sinek doing a short video for NAIS, the National Association of Independent Schools, and he's explaining his concept of the infinite game and talking about how that translates to the school world. So let's take a look at that, and then we'll pick up afterwards.
So we are all unwitting players in these things called infinite games, games that have no finish lines. There's no such thing as winning marriage, there's no such thing as winning business, and there's definitely no such thing as winning education. The problem is that too many leaders use language like being number one, being the best. They're thinking with a finite mindset. And the problem is when you play with a finite mindset in an infinite game, there's a few very predictable outcomes. Decline in trust, decline in cooperation, decline in innovation, which means we have to learn to adjust our mindset to lead with an infinite mindset for the game we're actually playing. There's a few things that have to be done to lead with an infinite mindset. One, we have to have a just cause. We have to have trusting teams. We have to have a worthy rival, a capacity for existential flexibility, and finally, the courage to lead. A just cause is a reason to come to work every day, a vision of the future so compelling that we would sacrifice to advance towards that vision. Maybe turn down a better paying job, or travel, or work late hours, not because we like those things, but it feels worth it because we feel like we're part of something bigger than ourselves. Trusting teams is to work in an environment where we feel safe enough to raise our hands and say, I made a mistake, I need more training, I'm struggling, I need help, without any fear of humiliation or retribution. And if we don't work in an environment that has trusting teams, what we do is we have teams in which people are lying, hiding, and faking every day. They're hiding mistakes, they're hoarding information, they'll never tell you that they don't know what they're doing, and eventually that creates problems inside the organization. Next, we have to have a worthy rival, someone who we recognize in our industry who may be better than what we do, may be better at what we do than we are. Not to hate them or compete with them, but rather to use them as a benchmark, because their strengths reveal to us our weaknesses, and their strengths reveal to us opportunities where we can improve. Because the goal in an infinite game is constant improvement, not to win, but to constantly improve. Worthy rivals help us do that. The capacity for existential flexibility means that we're willing to make a dramatic strategic shift away from one path that we're on towards another path that we may think is better at helping us advance towards the just cause. It's hard because very often we've invested time and energy and money into one strategic path, and to simply uproot it and go somewhere else, we think, well, what about the money we've invested? We can't just walk away from it. That is the point of existential flexibility, that it's existential for the person, for the leader who makes that flex, because to stay on the path we're on will eventually lead to us falling out of the game, running out of the will and resources to stay in it. And finally, the courage to lead. This is hard. All the pressures are on us to be finite, to think finite, to win, to be number one, to be the best, and to abandon that way of thinking, to reconfigure our minds to think not in terms of wins and losses, but to think of advancing. A lot of probably school leaders think that it's important to be ranked number one so that they can attract more students. You know, if you do well in the rankings, it's a lucky strike extra, but that's not the purpose. But rather to have a cause, rather to say that we're committed to building strong individuals, students who will learn to form deep, meaningful relationships, cope with stress, learn to connect with each other beyond their own devices. This is what we're committed to. And though the rankings are important, they're not end-all be-all. The children that we're churning out of our school are the most important thing, and those are the things we're committed to. So how do you know that you lived a life worth living by the end? Is it because you taught for 30 years? Is it because you were once voted Teacher of the Year? Is it because your school, while you were there, became ranked #1 in some arbitrary listing? Or is it the knowledge that of the number of students who stay in touch with you, or come back to the school just to see you, or that when you see them being interviewed on television because they've made something out of their lives, and when asked, how did you become who you are, and they say the name of their 9th grade English teacher and credit that person with why I am who I am today in part. That's what it means to live an infinite life, that we commit ourselves to ensure that the lives of the people who come through our doors and the institution for which we work will be in better shape than we found it because of us and not in spite of us. And to look back and say, there are those who picked up where I left off. That's a life worth living. That's an infinite life.
Okay, so let's take a look at this. Here's what I'd like to do today. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about finite games versus infinite games. And specifically, I want to dig into why we love to play finite games and why our boards love to play finite games, and compare that to infinite games. Then we're going to look at, okay, what are the 5 things, and he mentioned those in his video, but we're going to dig a little bit deeper. What are the 5 things you need for infinite game thinking? We don't have time to look at all 5 of those, but we'll dig a little bit deeper into 3 or 4, depending on how much time we have. And then we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A and just discussion, because the biggest challenge, of course, is how do we take this information and incorporate it into our leadership style as we're leading faculty and also as we're leading our boards as well. So let's dive in. What's a finite game versus an infinite game? So finite games are what we have grown up with. Most of us have good, feelings, fun feelings when we think about growing up and playing these kinds of games. So finite games are what you think of when you think of a board game or a sports event. The players are known. It's awesome because you know what, your team, you wear all the same colors and the opposing team wears all the same colors. So there's no question about who is on your team and who the other team is. That's known. It's awesome. They're fixed rules. Okay, we know that this is how this team is going to act. These are the plays we're going to always run. Just fixed rules about what we're supposed to do in the game. There's an agreed upon objective. So we all understand what winning looks like, and we all understand that the game has an end. It can be when the clock runs out. It can be when you hit a certain score. It can be, if you're shooting hoops, when you spell horse, whatever. But there's some type of agreed upon objective and an understanding when the game ends. And the best part about it all is there's this great finite set of rules that covers just about every possible scenario, and a third-party objective referee who enforces those rules. Now, you know how that is. There's always a little bit of discussion there about whether or not the referee is enforcing the rules properly, but at least you have a referee you can call upon, and at least you have a set of rules that you can call upon. We love finite games. And because we love finite games, I think this also can bleed into our leadership and can bleed into our strategic thinking, because they're attractive. Why are they attractive? Well, they're action-oriented. Action-minded leaders, action-minded boards love the idea of finite games because you can measure them as well. So a finite game, for example, is enrollment management. Enrollment management is critical to the infinite game, but that's not the game in and of itself. But enrollment management is awesome because you can measure it. Same with fundraising. Fundraising is a critically important to what we're doing, critically important to our just cause, but it's not the game. But we love it because we can measure it. It's immediate, it's fixed, and frankly, we like to win. And I can't think of an industry right now that needs wins. I mean, we have been really struggling this fall and trying to make everything work. And so if there's anything that we can set as a win, oh my gosh, why would we not want to do that? Finite games are very different from infinite games. And Sinek's theory is the infinite game is really the game we're playing, whether we know it or not. What do we know about the infinite game? Well, the infinite game has known players and unknown players. For example, 12 months ago, I don't think we had an idea that the player COVID-19 would be such a dominant player in our game. That's an example of an unknown player, and infinite games have unknown players. There's no exact or agreed upon rules. So we're still trying to figure out, for example, what the economic impact of COVID is going to be. We don't have a rule book. There's not a sliding scale we can point to. We're looking at things like a pretty dramatic decline in consumer confidence. That's a little bit scary for us. Unemployment is recovering a little bit, but we took a huge jump in unemployment. We don't really know what that's going to do to all of us. So there's no exact or agreed upon rules. And finally, there's no time horizon and there's no finish line in the game that we're playing. The way Sinek describes that is there's no winning education. You can say our goal is to be number one in your particular city. You can say our goal is to have the highest test scores. You can say we have 100% acceptance into our students' first choice high school or college, whatever. But the real point of an infinite game is not to quote win, unquote. The goal is to be able to keep playing. And when we talk about generative thinking, it's that kind of approach. When I work with boards on generative thinking, I frame it this way. What are you doing today to make sure that when your current students have kids, they can come back to your school? That's
David, I'm glad you said that. I was just going to point out just the idea that I think about all the times that I, as a school head, how we kind of define ourselves by if we're the biggest school, do we have the most students?
Right.
Or we try to define ourselves in some respects by, do we have the highest, standardized test scores, or our kids leave with, and they score in their standardized test at 90% or better. Those are all and we get pushed in that. As a head of school, I can remember having business people who worked in a situation where they could define stuff pretty easily. They would push me for what are we winning? Are we number one? And it's a challenge as a head of school and as a leader to push back and say it's not our whole point.
Well, and it's a real push me pull you. And I'm preaching, so if you know good preachers, generally good preachers when they preach a really good sermon, they're generally preaching themselves. Mm-hmm. And this is definitely my situation too, because think about benchmarking. I mean, we love to benchmark. Oh my gosh, we love to benchmark. Yeah. It's measurable. It gives us some, some confidence in we're doing the right thing and we're heading in the right direction. But what we have to make sure is that benchmarking process doesn't become the game to quote win, unquote. The benchmarking process should be data that we're using to inform how are we doing on our mission. And that's a big jump to make. And it's at least for me personally, it's a hard jump to make because I like data and I like to be able to point to progress. And so that's part of the mind shift that we're talking about here. So let me ask this question. So the real challenge is, do we know what games we're playing? And do our boards know what game that we're playing? So and again, this is kind of a kind of esoteric question, but when you think about your board and when you think about just based on what we talked about today with regard to finite and infinite games, think about how your board is spending its time and energy. How much of its time and energy do you think is spent on finite games? How much of the time and energy is spent on infinite games? So finite games are these kind of quote wins, unquotes that we want to rack up. Infinite games are what are we doing to make sure we can keep playing the game? And there's not a right answer to this. This is just kind of a way for us to start talking about how do we translate this into our leadership with our faculty, and how do we translate this into our leadership with the boards? So where would you put yourself on this? And again, there's not a right or wrong answer, but where would you put yourself on this? We'll leave it open for a few more seconds. Okay, last call. So let's see. So yeah, a little bit all over the map, and that's what I'd expect. So we've got a couple that think, some that think 100% finite games. I think lots of our boards are more on that end, honestly. Handful that are kind of in the 75-25, a handful that are half and half, and then some that are, we're pretty good at least putting more than half of our energy into infinite games as opposed to finite games. So, Mary Katherine, from your experience as a long tenured head working with, several board rotations, how would you say? I mean, it kind of probably goes up and down too, based on your board population.
Yeah, I think it does. I also think that it could be contingent a little bit upon the kind of the circumstances you're in. Right now, I'm sure that it's pretty difficult to keep boards focused on maybe some more infinite thinking because we're so in the weeds with COVID. I think. Yeah. I also think that, again, like I said, I think it's always a challenge when you have people on your board that they're in businesses that are black and white kind of businesses where they create something, or it's clear what it's sales generated. So either we hit our sales projections or we didn't. You have people in leadership that are pushing that direction, it's harder to try to connect with people and get them to think differently. Not to always push the Enneagram, but I think that the wiring of people has to be talked about in this, because depending upon your wiring, some of us are a lot more competitive. And so if you're a competitive person and winning is the thing, that's going to be a harder mindset shift than if you are more of a gray kind of consensus builder, right, as a leader. So I think whether you've got those people on your board that are like that, or you've got the people that are or you're like that, that's going to play into whether this idea of infinite versus finite is something you can grasp.
Yeah, I agree with that. So now we're shifting to, okay, if we want to play infinite games, if we want to have the skills to be able to play infinite games, and he uses this really in his leadership. So I'm thinking leadership with faculty now, but you can't dismiss it from how you're leading your board as well. But Sinek would say that, look, to succeed in the infinite games, we have to stop thinking about who wins, and start thinking about how to build organizations that are healthy enough to stay in the game for generations to come. And he, a huge proponent of healthy team building. And so it's no surprise that that's a big part of the 5 elements needed to be able to respond to infinite games. So we're going to talk about 4 of those 5. I want to talk a little bit about a just cause, because I think that's critically important for Episcopal schools. I want to talk a little bit about trusting teams, because generally when I get called in to do work, either with the head of the board or head with the faculty, there's always a little bit of growth area on trusting teams. We're not going to have time to talk about the worthy adversary. That's a great chapter in the book, but we're not going to have time to cover that today. Existential flexibility, we have to talk about that, since we have all experienced a dramatic dose of existential flexibility with COVID. And then finally, some thoughts on courageous leadership, because as Sinek said, this is not easy. So it all starts with having a just cause. And so the goal, again, is to make sure that we can advance something bigger than ourselves. And he defines a just cause as a specific vision of the future so appealing that people will be willing to sacrifice to make it happen. So we all have mission statements. We all have vision statements. The question is, do our mission statements and vision statements truly articulate our just cause? And I think in some schools, yes. In some schools, I'm not sure. A lot of mission statements I look at, honestly, they could be the mission statement of just about any independent school in the country. Some mission statements of our schools, I also, could be a great mission statement for a non-sectarian school. which is interesting, for an Episcopal school. So that's one place to start, is really look at your mission and vision and ask the question, okay, is this specific vision so appealing that people are willing to sacrifice to make it happen? And there's a test for that. If you want to take a look at your mission statement or your vision statement, then bounce it up against, these 5 elements. It needs to be something affirmative and optimistic. It needs to be inclusive, something that's open to anyone who wants to play the infinite game with you. It needs to be service oriented. There needs to be an element of resilience in there. And it needs to be relatively idealistic, big, bold, and ultimately aspirational. But it needs to be that big of a cause in order for it to be a just cause. There are 2 examples in the book of missed opportunities for a just cause. So the first is the publishing industry. If you think of the publishing industry and how that has shifted over time, Sinek thinks that they missed the opportunity of creating a just cause and an infinite strategy because they focused on selling books as opposed to this idea of what happens if our just cause is spreading ideas across the globe in order to inspire and encourage. Would that open up a just cause that could possibly make sure that we're going to be able to play this game, even though there's half-price bookstores and there's free content and all of that material out there that is bigger than just selling books?
Yeah, and the Kindle. Think about this with the missing the opportunity to be involved in. We're just going to sell books versus that actually getting into that technology quick enough. We're a Kindle or an iPad.
Yeah, and some arguably did, and others arguably missed the boat.
Right.
Music industry is another example of this. This idea of being focused on the finite game of selling records as opposed to a just cause of really sharing music broadly to improve people's lives and keeping in the industry to do that as opposed to just selling records. Records there's a vintage market now for records, but Napster came on board, and then iTunes came on board, and Pandora. That completely Pandora and all of the, there's probably half a dozen different music sharing apps and communities now, and that really affected the industry. And as a result, some of those labels don't exist anymore. Some of those publishers don't exist anymore.
Right.
So that's an example of 2 missed opportunities. For us, I think there's 3 things that we need to make sure don't become what I call our pseudo just cause. And this can be a trap for a board, I think. A moonshot is not a just cause. Or a BHAG, a really big goal, programmatic or otherwise, or a new building, or, new offerings, or expanding your grades, or whatever. That's not a just cause. That may be inspiring. That may really represent a programmatic need that you should do. No matter how awesome they are, they're still finite in that it's going to come to an end. That may advance the infinite game and allow you to keep playing, but if it's doing that, it's still pointing towards an infinite game, and you need to be cognizant of what that infinite game is. This is one we've already talked about a little bit, but boards fall into this trap as well. Being the best is not a just cause. Why? Because it's totally arbitrary. Being the best in the city, well, based on what? Having the best test scores, well, based on what? Whatever. Being the best is not a just cause because it's arbitrary. I don't know how you're going to, quote, win, unquote, education. You can have some really great elements in your program, but you're not going to win the game of Episcopal School, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it also fails the test around service oriented.
Yeah, it's pretty us focused, right?
Right.
So yeah, that's a challenge as well. And then growth is not a just cause. Growth for the purpose of growth is not a just cause. Now, if we're talking about growth because there's some elements to that growth that are going to allow us to advance our mission and are going to make sure that we're here in another generation, that's fine. But again, that's not growth for growth's sake. Lots of schools and lots of boards will say, we have an enrollment goal of X. I really caution boards, be a little bit careful about that, and be very careful about incentivizing your head to hit a target number. Why? Because your head can hit that target number, but there's no guarantee that your head will hit that target number with mission appropriate students. Mm-hmm. So you don't want to unintentionally incentivize bad admission behavior. So growth, again, not a just cause. The example in the book is, if you're loading up your car and your neighbor comes out to you and says, "Where are you going?" And you say, "I'm going on vacation." He said, No, where are you going? "I'm going on vacation. I told you." "No, where are you going?" "I'm going on vacation." You're not answering the question. Where is the school headed? I mean, where are you going? Are you going to, are you going to Florida? Are you going to fishing? Whatever. So growth for growth's sake isn't a just cause. SAES, what's our just cause? Well, our just cause is to support leaders of Episcopal schools so our students will go out into the world loving others as they've been loved by God. That's why we exist. We exist to support leaders so that our schools can turn kids out that are going to go out and make the world a better place. I can't think of a more just cause right now than that. So let me stop there and just have you type in the chat box. Tell me, how is your school on articulating its just cause? I was going to make this a poll question, but I'd rather just get some discussion. So just type in the chat box. And let's have a little bit of conversation about how is your school doing at knowing their just cause and articulating it.
As people are talking, typing in the chat box, I think it's, when I first read this book, I thought to myself, what more a school is such a perfect kind of example of a place that could play the infinite game, because we do have such a, while our schools are different in terms of maybe what we provide or the programming or whatever, schools have such a perfect just cause. Because what can you imagine that would fail? None of them, all of the testing of the just cause applies to schools where you are able to look at what you're doing out in the world and what you're putting out into the world and how you're affecting the world with the things that you do on a daily basis. If that makes sense.
I think the potential trap is making sure that our mission statements and our vision statements articulate that.
Correct.
Because so many mission statements don't describe what you just described. So many mission statements describe best practices in education, which is important. Yeah. Going back to Sinek's earlier work, it's all about the why as opposed to the how and the what.
Exactly.
We get really focused on the how and the what because it's measurable. We get focused on the how and the what because that's what parents like to hear. They like the reassurance of the how and the what. Mm-hmm. But it really goes back to how are we doing at articulating our why. And gang, you can't articulate your why if the community doesn't have a shared why.
Right.
And that's where things really get off the rails. If the board has a certain why, the head has a certain why, and the faculty have a certain why.
Exactly.
We talk about the ISM. If you haven't looked at the ISM, price, product, process schools.
Yes.
That's a great tool to kind of define what kind of school you are. My hypothesis is that we have lots of schools that are actually process schools, which describes one way to do school, that are led by product-focused faculty and also governed by price-focused boards.
Yep.
And so that's an example of having a foot in three different worlds. And it really can't be done. Most of our schools are process schools. So we have to all be on the same page on what's our process and what are we trying to accomplish with our process.
So we've got a few comments on the chat. Colin says, I think we know our just cause and have a variety of ways of communicating it. My enrollment director will communicate it one way. A teacher may express it differently. Parents would articulate another. Linda Ansel says, we are preschool only. So for us, I would have safe, having happy children come to school, eager to explore and have a new adventure, and while especially keeping them safe. McClay says our school seems to be somewhat lost on our just cause, trying to focus in on our mission, but it can be hard, especially during times of transition and during pandemic stress. for sure, McClay. And then Colin says we probably need to align our whys.
Yeah, great comments. And I think I think all these are probably pretty common with our heads that are wrestling with this. So, the preschool piece, articulating the why for the preschool piece is a fun exercise. I mean, you think about the critically important foundation work that's happening at that 2, 3, 4, 5 grade level. And, what a just cause to make sure that we're going to instill a love of learning that this kiddo is going to take with them in through elementary grades and beyond. I mean, what a wonderful, awesome just cause where we're sending kids out that have that love of learning and know how to love each other and are, understand the basic foundations of what we would call down the road ethics or character, but oh my gosh, and safety too. I mean, that's what an important part there. And I think it's probably okay, going to Colin's comment, I think it's probably okay if, you're using different words. I mean, I think everyone to some extent, your mission statement obviously should be the same, but I think it's probably okay to articulate in different words.
Different perspectives.
Different perspectives, so long as there's that common understanding as well. And I read the comment about, being somewhat lost on just cause. That resonates with me. I mean, one of the reasons we're having this conversation now is because this work is so difficult in the midst of the pandemic. We've got a great conversation going on the discussion board right now that's, pretty tactical on how are we going to handle families traveling for Thanksgiving and faculty members traveling for Thanksgiving and making sure that we come back and we're all safe. That's a very important, very tactical conversation that boards are having to wrestle with. And, we need to start talking about, okay, how do we do this? How do we ease back into doing this type of work? And really making sure, because this is going to be the work that's going to keep us going, as important as it is to make sure we've got a set policy on people coming back after Thanksgiving holiday. I'm not saying that's not important. Believe me, it is. But that's not going to be what keeps us going for generations to come, if that makes sense. Yeah. So I think part of us doing this is really just trying to plant some seeds on how do we do this work? If we're in a school that maybe has struggled with what is our just cause, what are some steps we can do to really get back to that conversation? It may start with something as minor as, let's have a reflection upon the first semester and everything that we did with COVID and how that was consistent with our mission statement. Or do we need to re-articulate our mission statement to advance our just cause? That may be a way to kind of tiptoe into this, if that makes sense. Let's look at the next element, trusting teams. So again, Sinek says, in order to do this, you've got to have trusting teams. If you're only playing for the short wins, the enrollment wins, the fundraising wins on the annual fund, it's very difficult to build a team that collaborates, because you have, hoarding of information, you have turf wars, turf battles. If the individual finite gains are what matter, then all of a sudden it's really hard to build a trusting team. What you can build a trusting team around is a unified just cause that goes beyond those finite games that we may find ourselves involved in at one point or another. One resource I really want to share about trusting teams is 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni. Phenomenal book. Here's a chart from that book. And really the idea of building a trusting team starts on that bottom level with trust, and then being able to develop a way to handle healthy conflict, which turns into commitment. You are committed to each other when you realize, oh, wow, we can disagree and work through it, and it's okay, which then turns into accountability, which then turns into results. So I've done a lot of work with faculty and with boards around this chart and that book. That book also has a field book that is really, really good. And so if you're looking for a resource on building trusting teams, I'd recommend that. We've had Brene Brown in before. She spoke at not the last biennial conference, but the previous biennial conference. She's written a ton of great work about trust and really says that, look, trust there's no magic recipe to this. It's just stacking and layering tiny little moments of vulnerability. Are you comfortable with being vulnerable around your team? Do you have teams that can ask for help? Do you have teams that can say, you know what, I am out of my comfort zone with regards to some of this online learning piece, or trying to do hybrid, trying to have a, half of the class here and then half of the class in cyberspace? Are they able to identify that as a weakness and ask for help? Those are examples of stacking. If they ask for help and they're greeted in a supportive way, those are tangible ways to build trust. Mary Katherine, you
Yeah,
experienced this with your faculty, I know.
for sure. And I was just going to kind of touch on that. I think for me, that always began with me, and it begins with the leadership of the school. So when it comes to faculty, your willingness to show vulnerability models that it's a safe place for them to do that. And I think sometimes we can inadvertently make it unsafe for our faculty to be vulnerable and not realize that we're doing that. So I think I would, as a matter of personal growth for a head of school, I would definitely recommend reading that the Pat Lencioni book. I would definitely recommend reading Brene Brown, because her book Courageous Leadership or Dare to Lead, those are both really important books in terms of when you are the leader, how you set up the team to be trusting. It really begins with you. And if you miss that step, building the trusting team is not going to happen.
Yeah, agreed. So here's another great book. This is a quote actually by Peter Drucker, but Marshall Goldsmith uses it in his book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, which is a book that I've used with our New Hedge University. Just basically saying, you know what, we spend a ton of time teaching our leaders what to do, but we don't spend as much time teaching our leaders what to stop. And stop being afraid of saying, I don't know. Stop being afraid of feeling like you've got to have all the answers. He looks at 20 different habits that leaders need to completely get out of, as opposed to things that you do. And there's a lot of that goes into being vulnerable and getting more comfortable with being vulnerable around your faculty and around your board as well. And it's hard because boards, I don't know, I think boards, you like to think that boards value their head being vulnerable, but I think that's hard. I think it's hard to go into a board meeting and be a little bit vulnerable. I mean, wasn't that your experience, MK?
Well, there's a difference between vulnerability and being emotional. When we ask somebody to be vulnerable, we're not asking you to go to a board meeting and cry. We're asking you to be willing to know what you don't know, and and yes, I mean, obviously there's risk in that. If you have a board that just like you may have a board that's unhealthy and not willing to accept that vulnerability, you can have, just like I'm talking about with the faculty who might have a boss that doesn't want to accept vulnerability. Yeah, there's risk in putting yourself out there, but there is also massive reward in being willing to say. I love what he talks about when he says that in a non-trusting team, you're going to have employees that hide things and act like they can do what they can't. And when you have people who are trying to do things that they don't know how to do, and you think that they know how to do them, you can have real bad results. And
I think we experienced this in the spring a little bit, particularly with online learning.
For sure.
Because I think that some of my schools reported that, we had faculty members that maybe they weren't in an environment where they were comfortable to say, whoa, I don't know how to do this, or I'm not sure how we're going to do this. And so I think in a lot of ways, while, I don't know if I'd wish the spring scenario on anyone, but the reality is, I think we built some trust in our teams through that process, if it was managed properly, if that makes sense. If it wasn't managed properly, then we've got a wonderful opportunity now to hold a mirror up to that and say, you know what, here's how we're going to do it moving forward.
Well, the truth is, none of us grow. We say this to our kids. I mean, I know that I say this to my own two children all the time. And I said this to my faculty. you don't grow from your successes.
Right.
You don't grow from your wins. You grow from your mistakes and from the things that you, and so to not be able to recognize a mistake or not be able to say, hey, I didn't really know how to do that, or I don't know how to do that, and I need help. We've got to be able to do that.
Yeah. So the other piece is existential flexibility. Now, again, if you were a school that is dyed in the wool, we've always done it this way, and this is the only way to do it. The upside is that you got a great experience with existential flexibility in the spring, because I mean, it was a extreme disruption and really caused us to look at, okay, what are we trying to accomplish here? Because we're not able to do it the way we used to. So really, what are we trying to accomplish? Are we trying to accomplish, A, B, and C in education? Are we trying to accomplish safe environments for our students? Are we trying to accomplish emotionally supportive or nurturing environments? What are we really trying to accomplish? Because the good old fashioned, they roll in at carpool at 8 o'clock and they roll out at 3 o'clock. That wasn't happening. There's a great story about Eastman Kodak and their inability to really embrace existential flexibility in the book. We don't need to go into that right now, but looking back at the spring, if you do a postmortem of the spring experience, that was a great test on how does your community tolerate existential flexibility. Right. From the accreditation world and the association world, we wrestle with this because there are always things that could cause us to get our arms around existential flexibility. We don't know what's going to happen in the elections coming up. We're in right now states that historically have really been pretty positive towards independent education. That can change. And so existential flexibility can also come not just from viruses, but can come from legislation and changes in policy and all of those things, in addition to a large employer in your school, in your city closing. There's all sorts of different ways where you can come face to face with an existential threat, and the ability to look that existential threat in the eye and figure out, what, we're going to keep playing our game. The field may look different and how we play may look different, but we are going to keep playing our game because our cause is that important.
Yeah.
The last part is courageous leadership. And that just comes down to the fact of how difficult all this is. I think it absolutely starts with a leader being able to be vulnerable. But the question is really, what type of leaders our community need right now? There's two things I want to highlight, one from a book and one from a speaker that we've had in. If you haven't read The Splendid and the Vile, I recommend that you read that book. It's a phenomenal book that looks at Churchill during the bombings in World War II. From the leadership perspective, the leadership kernel to take away is, if you look at the talks that he gave the nation, the addresses that he gave, there were two things. He never, ever pulled a punch. He told his people, here's what we're up against, and it's going to be rough. And he never, ever sugarcoated anything. But also, he never, ever ended that speech without making sure you understood we're going to make it. And he would call upon different things to make sure that we're going to make it. It was always related to Britain's just cause, mm-hmm. and what they were called to do in the globe, and the values that they were called to do, the values they were called to uphold, that were so markedly different from the values of the enemy. And so it's a great exercise, and you learn a whole bunch about Churchill that you don't learn in traditional textbooks, which is kind of fun. But it's a great text and a really, really good leadership case study for some of the things that we're called to do right now. The second thing I want to highlight is Michael Thompson. So we've had Michael Thompson in a couple of different times. We had him and Rob Evans in this summer to kind of talk about leadership in general. We had Michael back for our heads meeting in the fall. And then we're actually working on Michael Thompson and Rob Evans to do a parent event for the parents of our schools as well. But Michael's response to what kind of leaders our community need right now was pretty simple. You have to have the ability to let everyone know we're going to be okay. Now, this wasn't his language, but he's talking infinite game. I mean, he's talking about we're going to keep playing the game, but same type of idea. So no matter how, scary some news may be that you have to share with your board and with your faculty, Bill Churchill, Michael Thompson, all the courageous leaders that Sinek highlights, it has to do with the ability to say, we're going to figure this out and we're going to keep playing our game. So
yeah, and one thing I would point out too is that, like it or not, and this is something I think Michael and Rob talked about in June, like it or not, our schools are looking to us as heads of school. Our communities are looking to us to hear what we have to say about it. So make no mistake, as a school head, you must step up and have something to say. You can't avoid that. That's just not something. It obviously that, if we have a priest on our campus, a lot of times when we were in situations where there was something unsettling, our priest would stand up and kind of, make a statement and people would feel better, right? Well, right now, our school heads are having to do that. And that's just the way it is. And you gotta, that's one of the things Michael said, is that don't think that that's not important for you as a head you got to show that leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple things to close with, then we're going to open it up for conversation. But before I stop the recording, a couple of questions for consideration if you're trying to figure out what do I do with this. First is, does your board know what game they're trying to play? Really talk about how they're defining winning. What does winning look like? Are they trying to win finite games, or are they open to the idea of our goal is to keep playing the game? That's our win. And also, what are some things that you can do to help boards see the infinite game? I would start by just introducing the concept and then really try to highlight, going back to that question of how much energy is being spent, really try to highlight how much of our time as a board is focused on infinite game discussions, games or discussions that are going to allow us and put us in a position to keep playing, versus finite games, which, play a role in what we're doing, but probably are not the most important. So I'm going to stop the recording. If you're watching the recording, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to stop the recording, and then we're going to open it up for some free discussion.